Then I would like to welcome you to today's GOC technical session or webinar, where we will be discussing the recipe management feature of the GOC. So just as a quick overview, recipes are basically structured sets of process parameters that reside within your controller memory, and so that when new products need to be manufactured, the stored recipe can be downloaded directly to your PLC variables. This allows rapid changeovers with minimal operator input and less mistakes due to operator error. The GOC supports a recipe management function within its HMI functions. And to add recipes to the GOC43, you need to create a recipe manager. So when working with the GOC's recipe management feature, 3 terms in general will be used, which would be the recipe variables, which are the parameters or ingredients of a recipe. So this will be the variables storing the values for the recipe. Next would be the recipe itself, which would be the set of value of the ingredients. And last but not least, it would be the recipe definition, which is basically the set of recipe variables and recipes themselves combined. So we will be referring or using these terms throughout the presentation. So just to give it a bit of an example and actually more specific, put it in the example we will be using today. When referring to recipe variables, this would be for a hot beverage machine. This would be referring to milk, water, or coffee powder, and so on and so forth. And when we are referring to the recipe, it would be like tea, cappuccino, black coffee, whereas the recipe definition would be the collection of these two things. So to start off with our specifications for the recipe management of the GOC, first off, your number of recipe definitions you are allowed to declare are 4, so you have a maximum of 4 recipe definitions. For the recipes themselves, so per recipe definition, you are allowed to have 16 recipes. When it comes to the recipe variables, you're allowed to do 32 variables per recipe definition. The file type in which your recipe files are stored can either be set as textual, which is the default, or binary, and your file extension would be .txt recipe. You are able to back up your recipe files, but this will be alongside the application program, and we'll be discussing that in a moment. You can also upload recipe files from the controller to the PC via the SD card backup. Yeah. So one thing to take note when dealing with the recipe management, data types such as string, W-string, and L-time are not supported within the Codasys recipe manager. So those data types you are not allowed to use within your recipe. When it comes to backing up your recipe files, you're able to do so by or via the application backup, so backup application function, which essentially creates a backup of your entire application program as well as your recipe files on your SD card. You can also use this backup to restore the application function or application and therefore also restore your recipe files. Alternatively, you can remove the SD card from the GOC and transfer the recipe files to a PC as well. You aren't able to upload the files directly from the GOC, so the way to do this would be using the SD card. When it comes to deleting or removing recipe files from the GOC's memory, there are two ways to remove or delete these files. The first being is the reset origin command, which essentially initializes your GOC memory. So it completely wipes it, factory resets it. That way you can delete all files, recipe files in the GOC memory at once. But note this also wipes any application program on the GOC, so you will need to make sure you have sufficient backups of your program if you wish to do this. The second option for deleting recipes will be via the visualization objects, which will be covered within the visualization section of this presentation. Now, to start off with configuring, there are a few steps that you need to follow. So the first step is adding a recipe manager, then setting your recipe manager parameters, and then declaring a recipe definition, after which you declare recipe variables and link them to that recipe definition. And last but not least, you actually add your recipes. But before starting to configure this within CodeAssist, there are a few things you need to look at first. So these things include creating a project for your application program, configuring your PLC settings, and declaring recipe values to be used for your recipe definitions. So you need to make sure that these variables that you want to use to store the recipe values are declared within a variable declaration area that is run in the main task, because if it's not run in the main task, these variables will not work. So I'll be moving over to CodeAssist, but I will be jumping back a bit later on. So here I have already created a project for today's demonstration, and already finished the prerequisites, which include the PLC settings, which you can currently see, and also declaring my variables that I'll be using for today. So to create or add a recipe manager, which would be our first step for configuring the recipe management feature, is to right click on the application in your device tree, say add object, and then navigate to recipe manager. You can then just click add, and once you've done that, it will be added to your device tree. Now, as you can see, a recipe manager window has opened up. This is where you set settings or parameters for your recipe manager, and this includes things like the storage type. So I mentioned that you're able to store your recipe files are either textual or binary, and this is where you'd be able to select binary if you do not want a textual storage type. This also shows you what file extension the recipe file is, and you can select a separator. So the separator is what separates the different values and recipes within your recipe file. So this basically determines how the recipe file itself will look. This is also where you select what you want included within your recipe file. So currently the selected columns are the variable as well as the current variable. So if I would like, I can add the type, name, comment, minimal value, as well as the maximal value to my recipe file. So that's it for the storage tab. When moving over to the general tab, you also have a few settings. So the first one is recipe management in the PLC. So this allows or enables your recipe management feature. So if you uncheck this box, the recipe management feature will not work. Secondly, you have your save recipe changes to recipe files automatically. It's also recommended to not ever uncheck this box. It basically just saves any changes to your recipe files on a new download if there has been a change. The next is the load recipe options. So you can either load only by exact match of variable list or load matching variables by variable name. It's generally recommended that you do use the exact match so that there's no errors or unexpected behaviors that pop up. Next is the write recipe. This is where you can choose whether the value of the recipe needs or is limited to the minimum and maximum you set, or whether you simply just don't write the values if the values are out of range. This would make more sense in a moment when we start setting up the recipes. And last but not least, the check recipe for changes. It just allows you to check whether there are changes for your recipe. So this is the settings or the parameters that you're able to set for your recipe manager. Once you are happy with what you have set, you can move on to configuring a recipe definition. To do this, you right click on Recipe Manager, go to Add Object, and say recipe definition. For this, you will need to name your recipe definition, which for today we'll be naming it hot bev for hot beverages, and then click add to add it to our device tree. Now, opening up the hot bev or this recipe definition window, it will be blank to start off with, and you need to, or the recipe variables need to be added. So I've already pre-declared my variables, which will be hot water, milk, coffee powder, sugar, as well as tea. So that is what variables I will be using for my recipe definition. And to add your variables, you click on the open field in the variable column, go to the action button, which opens your input assistant window, and browse to the applicable variables. So starting off with coffee powder, hot water, milk, sugar, and then last but not least, tea. Okay, so now the recipe variables have been added, and you are able to now populate some of the other columns that you can see here, which is the name, which you basically just give this variable a name to indicate what it is. So this would be coffee powder for me. Luckily, my variables are descriptive, but if you're using variables that aren't as descriptive, this name can be helpful. Yeah, then you are able to add a comment. So for instance, if I would like to say this is an ingredient for my recipe, I am able to do this. So the comment is not necessary, the name is not necessary, it's just there as a tool to help you understand or give more description to your variables. Now next are your minimal and maximal values. So you can basically limit the values of your variables to whatever you set here. So if I say my minimal value for all of these are 0, then I'm not able to enter anything less than 0. If I set, for instance, my maximal value for my coffee powder to 20, I will not be able to add anything more than 20 to this variable. So if you recall, let me actually just quickly go back to the setting, this right recipe. So currently we have selected limit the variable to minimum maximum when recipe value is out of range. So for instance, if my coffee value would be 30, if that was the value that it's currently at, it will be limited to 20, as that is how we have set it up, or how it has been set up at the moment. If I were to choose the other option, no, these values will not be written to the PLC variables, as there is a value that is out of range. So going forward, say the maximum for this would be so that is our recipe variables that with the columns populated. And once you've done this, you are able to add actual recipes to your recipe definition. So this would be your recipe variables. And now to add your recipes, you right click anywhere in the recipe definition window and select add a new recipe. So for instance, we would like to add black coffee as a recipe. And say, okay. So when you do this, you'll see a new column pop up that is tinted yellow, and is also named what you just named it. And now you're able to add the recipe variables values that will be loaded into your variables, PLC variables, when this recipe is loaded. So for instance, let's say this needs to be 20 and the rest is hot water because this is black coffee. Actually, let's wrong one. Yeah. So theoretically, if that was our or is our variable values, whenever I select black coffee to be loaded, these values will be stored within these variables. So you can add up to 16 recipes to this recipe definition. So for instance, if we would add tea, it will add a second recipe column, in which case and use that as our recipe values as an example. So now the configuration of your recipe definition is finished. You're able to move on to your visualizations. So as I mentioned, the recipe management feature of the GOC takes place fully within its HMI functions and it cannot be accomplished via any PLC programming. So to load or save any recipes, you're required to do it via your visualization objects. But to start off, I'll be adding some displays so that we can see our variable values. So to start off, let's say start off with our coffee powder ingredient, and we will be displaying this. So and then last but not least, our sugar ingredient display. So all I have done in this case is just configured shapes to display my ingredient variables or variable values, and this is just purely to help demonstrate how the values are loaded or saved via the recipe management feature. So to load, okay, let's actually cover this. So you have two options when it comes to your recipe management. You have your load recipe and save recipe, or save recipe as, technically speaking, where your load recipe command or function loads the values from your recipe file. So that's the values that you have set within your recipe definition here. That loads those values from your file into your PLC memory, into the variables that you have set up. Whereas when selecting or using the save recipe command, it takes the variables currently stored with values currently stored within your variables and saves it to the recipe file. So one is from the recipe file to the PLC variables, and the other is from the PLC variables to the recipe file. So to start off, let's look at the load recipe command. So I'm just using a normal button visualization object. And to configure this for the recipe management load recipe, I'll select any input configuration type, which for this case, I'll just use on mouse click, select configure, which gives me this input configuration window. So to start off, you select execute command and add it to your right hand column to have it be applied to this button. So you'll see the execute command interface where I can select load a recipe from a file, and after you've done this, you add or click on the plus button, which allows you to configure this command. So for the first parameter, you enter the recipe definition which you are currently using For this case, it's hot bev. And secondly, this is where you will need to enter the recipe name of that you want to load. So currently we don't actually have anything set up for this. So I'm just going to save the configuration as it currently is and show you. So you need to tell the recipe or management what recipe to load. So to do this, we will need to add a user input for our recipe name. So for the input to work, so I've already set up a recipe name for string. And if you recall, I did not include this within my recipe definition due to the fact that string is not a supported data type for recipe management. So this now displays my recipe name, and I'll also want to be able to configure or enter a recipe name. So that would be selecting on input configuration, then selecting write a variable, and last but not least, select use another variable and give it the variable that will store the recipe name. So this where the variable where it's stored is important because that's what you're going to enter in the second parameter of your load recipe. So I'm back on this page. So that recipe name variable is what you put as the second parameter for your load recipe from command. So if you now see in my properties window, it says execute command, load recipe from, with hot bev as my first parameter and the recipe name as the second. So just checking that there are no errors, I'm now able to download my application program to my GOC. While that is downloading, I'll just quickly go through some things. As you are not able to see my screen or my GOC screen, is when the load or the save as button is pressed on the GOC itself, a dialog or pop-up window pops up, which allows you or shows you the list of recipe files on the GOC memory and allows you to load the recipe. So the pop-up window or dialog window that you can see on the right hand here is specifically that for the load recipe, and when you press load, the recipe will load automatically as the way we have set it up already inputs the recipe name in this file name here. So all you need to do is press load and those recipe values will be loaded into your PLC variables. Just also note the same goes for the save recipe button or command. This also opens up this dialog that you can see on the right hand side, and it essentially looks exactly the same as the load recipe dialog or pop-up window, with the difference being the save button, because in this case you will be saving the recipe to, or the values to, a recipe file. So just popping back to Codesys. Apologies, this that should still work. So let me just So I'm quickly gonna set up the variables that of my recipe in my watch window, so that when I do press buttons on my GOC, you will be able to see that the values will change. And last but not least, my recipe. So starting off with, let's say, the tea recipe, I'm now entering the name into my variable, which you can now see tea has been entered into the recipe name. And when I press load and load again, you should see the recipe values popping in to my variables, which you can see right here. So milk 20, hot water 6, coffee powder 0, sugar 10, and tea 10. Now, if I were to change this to black coffee, so it's important when the recipe name is entered, it shouldn't match exactly how it has been um, typed or input into your recipe definition. So for this case, I think I even made a yeah, bit of an error there. So I will have to exactly match the spelling with the space included. So having done that, now when I press load and load recipe, it should now load the black coffee values into my variables, which it now has. So now the milk is 0, hot water is 80, coffee powder is 10, and sugar is 10. So now that the load recipe command has been configured, I can now try and set up the save recipe as. But before we can do this, I need to add input configuration. So I need to be able to edit the values of my recipes. So that I can save either new values to an existing recipe file or save a completely new file all in all. So for instance, I'm just quickly fixing this one. So to do this, just go to input configuration and add right variable for each of them. So now I will be able to edit the recipe variable values via my HMI screen, so that if I wish to edit an existing recipe or add a new recipe, I will be able to do so. So to add a save recipe button to my GOC screen, I'll once again just use a button visualization object. And the configuration actually looks very similar to the load recipe. You also use an execute command, and the difference being you select the save a recipe file, save a recipe in a file, and after you've done that, do this. And once again, your recipe definition is your first parameter, with the second parameter being the recipe name variable. Yes, I still have it copied. So that is how you configure the save recipe as command. And yeah, so just a note, if you are trying to save values in a recipe name that already exists, it will overwrite the current recipe file. So just take note of that. But the GOC will prompt you before it overwrites, just to check whether you are wanting or to overwrite the recipe file. You also have the option of declaring or saving a completely new recipe, and to do that you just enter a unique recipe name at the top there. So if I now done this to my GOC, I can show you how the save command works. Yeah. So once again, going back to my watch window, if I do enter, for instance, once again, T into my recipe name, and say load, you'll see the variables or the values popping up in the variables. So if, for instance, I want to change the recipe to have no sugar, let's say I set the sugar to 0 on my HMI screen, which you should see show up now. So now my sugar is 0. I can now select my save option and say save. So if I do change to black coffee now, so I've entered black coffee in my recipe name. If I do load this recipe now, you can see it changed to the black coffee. Now, if I do go back to tea and call up that recipe again, it should have the new values. I did not save it. Apologies. Let's do this again. So once again, setting sugar to 0, save recipe as, press save. Okay. But that is how that works. That is how the save as is set up. We can actually also try and add a new recipe to make it easy. I'll just add, or call it hot water. And then edit my values accordingly. Actually, that needs to be 100. Yeah. So, sorry if you couldn't see those values. So this is my new recipe that I have declared. That is purely hot water. So if I do load it now, it will appear as such. Let me actually just check one tiny thing. Okay, so that might be the reason why it wasn't working. That was just spelled incorrectly. So apologies. I can quickly run through that again. While that is loading, so in the beginning I mentioned there are two ways or two options to delete files, and the second being within your visualization objects. And this option allows you to delete individual recipe files via the save recipe as or load recipe dialog windows. So this is referring to these windows that pop up whenever the load recipe as or save or load recipe or save recipe as commands are executed. So when selecting a recipe and pressing the X in the upper right hand corner, you will be deleting that recipe file. So this is a way to delete individual recipe files from the GOC memory. So let's try the recipe save once again. So if I do T as my recipe, say load, the values will now pop into the PLC variables. And if I want to change my sugar to 0 and say OK, then save my recipe, it now prompts me to just say I'm currently overwriting an existing recipe file, to which I say yes. So if I now select or enter, let's say, the black coffee as my recipe, and load that, the values should change, which they now have. And if I now go back to T, you'll see the sugar value has stayed as the recipe has been altered. So going to T and loading those values, you now see the sugar value stayed 0. Now, if I wish to enter a completely new recipe, I can now change it via the HMI. Let's once again try and do hot water for this one. So everything is 0 except my hot water value, which is 100. So if I now select or enter the name for it as hot water, so that name is entered, and if I press save as, this now saves an entirely new recipe to an entirely new recipe file. So if I go back to T, select that and load that recipe, you can see the values change to the T values. And if I now once again want to select hot water, it will now be an option within my recipe files. So if I now select load, it will now, yeah. Okay. So that is the save command. So as you can see, this is what we had. And in the end, when it is actually running on the GOC, this is what it looks like. So the values are displayed. And that is actually all we will be discussing today for the recipe management feature. Are there any questions regarding this topic? So if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to type or just unmute. But for now, I'd just like to point out the next GOC technical session or webinar is on the 22nd of October, and this will be the topic will be Modbus TCP with remote I/O. So that session we will be connecting a Modbus TCP remote I/O to the GOC. There's also a possibility that we will be connecting a CC-Link I/Field Basic remote I/O to the GOC as well.